If you grew up anywhere near Calle Ocho in the 1970s, you already know the smell. That heavy sweetness of roasting pork fat mixing with the sharp bite of sour orange and garlic hitting a hot pan at 6 in the morning. It came through screen doors and kitchen windows, and it never fully left the block. The dishes on this list were not exotic. They were Tuesday. They were what a family of 6 ate when the father worked a double at the port and the mother stretched one pork shoulder across 3 meals. One of them required nothing more than an old chicken and a handful of spices, and it kept entire apartment buildings fed through hurricane season. Another built a sandwich so overstuffed that people drove across Dade County just to eat it standing in a parking lot. So hit subscribe, because here are 25 Cuban dishes that were normal in Little Havana, but nowhere else. Number 25. Croqueta preparada. This was not a croquette on a plate. This was a sandwich built around one. A length of Cuban bread, sliced open, layered with ham, Swiss cheese, and then a long ham croqueta pressed right into the center like it belonged there. The bread got hit with a plancha press until the outside cracked and the cheese melted into the croqueta shell. You could get one at any Ventanita along Flagler Street for pocket change. It was fast, greasy, and filling enough to get a warehouse worker through a 10-hour shift. The croqueta inside was creamy and soft, and the pressure from the plancha fused everything into one solid mass that you held with 2 hands and ate over a napkin. Nobody in the rest of the country was putting fried croquettes inside pressed sandwiches, but in Little Havana this was just what lunch looked like. Number 24. Frituras de malanga. Malanga is a root vegetable that looks like a rock covered in bark, peeled and grated raw, mixed with crushed garlic, a beaten egg, and a pinch of salt, then dropped by the spoonful into a pan of hot oil until the edges turned dark gold and the center stayed dense and starchy. These came out at every family gathering, every birthday, every Saturday afternoon when the kitchen was already busy with something else. Kids ate them plain off a paper towel on the counter. Adults squeezed lime over the top or dipped them in a garlic mojo that burned the back of the throat. They were never fancy, and that was the entire point. If malanga was in the house, frituras were happening within the hour. Nobody asked. Nobody announced it. The sound of the grater was the only announcement anyone needed. Number 23. Potaje de frijoles negros. Every Cuban household in Little Havana had a pot of black beans simmering on the stove at least 3 days a week. This was not refried beans. This was a thick, almost creamy soup built from dried black beans cooked for hours with green pepper, onion, cumin, oregano, bay leaf, and a generous pour of olive oil at the end. A splash of white vinegar went in right before serving. It sat on top of white rice and turned every plate into a complete meal regardless of what else was or was not on the table. The woman who made it measured nothing. She watched the color of the broth, smelled the steam, tasted from the wooden spoon, and adjusted. That pot was the heartbeat of the kitchen. It ran all week and got better every day. Number 22. Bistec empanizado. A thin cut of round steak pounded flat with a mallet until it was nearly translucent, dipped in egg, dredged in cracker meal, and fried in oil until the coating turned a deep bronze. The breading crackled loud when you cut into it with the side of a fork. Served with white rice, black beans, and a few slices of ripe tomato on the side. This was the Cuban answer to a Wiener Schnitzel, brought over from Havana, where it had been a weeknight staple since the early 20th century. In Little Havana, it stayed exactly what it had always been. A fast, affordable dinner that made one cheap piece of beef feed 4 people when the cracker meal stretched the portion and the rice filled in the gaps. The trick was pounding the meat thin enough that it cooked in under 2 minutes. That speed mattered when the kitchen was small and the children were hungry now. Number 21. Pan con bistec. Take that same pounded steak, fry it with sliced onions until the onions go soft and sweet, pile everything onto a length of Cuban bread, and press the whole thing on a plancha until the bread flattens and the meat juices soak through to the bottom. Shredded lettuce and sliced tomato on top. Mayonnaise on the bread. This was the working lunch of Little Havana through the 1970s and 1980s. The bread had to be Cuban bread. Not Italian, not French. Cuban bread has a thin, papery crust, and an interior so light and airy that it collapses under the plancha press without going tough or chewy. That bread made the sandwich. Without it, this was just a steak sub. With it, this was Little Havana on a plate. Number 20. Caldo Gallego. The name is Spanish. It means Galician broth. But in Little Havana, it became something else entirely. Cuban families made it with white beans, collard greens or turnip greens, chunks of ham hock, chorizo, and sometimes a piece of salt pork thrown in for extra weight. The pot simmered for hours until the beans started to break apart and the broth thickened on its own without any flour or starch. In Havana, this had been a winter dish, borrowed from the Spanish families who ran the bodegas and corner stores in the old city. In Miami, there was no real winter, but they made it anyway. They made it because the smell of that pot filling the apartment meant a full house. It meant a Sunday when nobody had to work and nobody was going anywhere. Families on Southwest 8th Street passed their caldo gallego recipe the same way they passed along the name of a trustworthy mechanic or the address of a landlord who would rent to Cubans without demanding first and last month up front. It was practical knowledge. It was survival dressed as soup. The beans were cheap. The greens were cheap. The ham bone cost almost nothing because nobody else at the supermarket wanted it. A woman with those ingredients and a large pot could feed 8 people on what most Americans spent on a single fast food meal. That arithmetic kept families together in the early years of exile when everything else was pulling them apart. The language barrier, the licensing exams that did not transfer, the jobs that paid half of what they earned back home. The soup did not solve any of that, but it meant nobody went hungry while they figured it out. Number 19. Vaca frita. The name means fried cow, flank steak or brisket, boiled first until tender, then shredded by hand into long fibers, marinated in lime juice and minced garlic, and fried in a hot skillet until the edges turned crisp and almost charred. The lime and garlic caramelized against the iron and created a crust that snapped between your teeth. The result was shards of beef that were soft in the center and crunchy on the outside, topped with raw white onion rings soaked in lime and served next to a mound of white rice. This was not a pretty dish. It looked like someone dropped the meat and then fried it again. But the flavor was so concentrated from that double cooking that one forkful explained why people ordered it 3 times a week without getting bored. Number 18. Masas de puerco fritas, cubes of pork shoulder, marinated overnight in sour orange juice and crushed garlic, then fried slowly in their own rendered fat until the outsides were burnished and cracking and the inside stayed juicy. Served with raw onion rings, a squeeze of fresh lime, and nothing else. This was an afternoon dish. A dish for dominoes on the porch, for men in undershirts arguing about baseball while the radio played in the background, for any gathering where cold beer was already open and nobody was in a rush. The pork had to be fatty. Lean pork made terrible masses because the fat rendered down during frying and basted the meat from inside, and without that internal basting, the cubes turned dry and forgettable. There is a particular quality to a neighborhood that feeds itself. Little Havana in the 1970s was not a tourist destination. It was not on any food map or travel guide. It was a stretch of Miami where Spanish was the first language on the sidewalk, where the bakeries opened before dawn, and where the smell of garlic and pork fat drifting out of kitchen windows was as constant and unremarkable as the humidity. The people who cooked these meals were not chefs. They were mothers and grandmothers and aunts who remembered exactly how things tasted in the kitchens they left behind and who refused to let that memory die even if nobody outside their block noticed or cared. Number 17. Yuca con mojo. A thick, starchy root, peeled and boiled in salted water until it split along the grain, then drowned in a sauce made from sour orange juice, olive oil, and an almost unreasonable amount of garlic fried until it went golden and fragrant. The garlic sizzled in the hot oil, and the citrus acid hit it, and the whole thing hissed and turned into a fragrant slick that pooled around the yuca on the plate. This showed up at every Noche Buena dinner, every birthday, every time someone roasted a pig in the backyard. It was the side dish that made the table feel finished, and without it, the meal felt incomplete no matter what else sat on the counter. The yuca had to be fresh. Frozen never had the same pull-apart texture, and everyone knew the difference. Number 16. Tamal and cazuela. This was not a tamale wrapped in a corn husk. This was the tamale filling cooked loose in a pot, like a thick, savory porridge. Ground corn cooked in pork broth with chunks of seasoned pork, tomato paste, cumin, and a bay leaf, all simmered together until it became something between a stew and a polenta. Cuban families made this when they wanted tamale flavor, but did not have the time or the many hands required to wrap dozens of individual husks. One pot served the entire family. You scooped it onto a plate like mashed potatoes, and it held its shape just enough to eat with a fork. The pork melted into the corn, and the corn thickened around the pork, and separating the two was impossible and unnecessary. Number 15. Chicharrones de pollo. These were not pork rinds. These were chunks of chicken, often thigh and drumstick, bone still in, marinated in lime juice and garlic for an hour, then dredged in seasoned flour and fried until the skin went deep brown and impossibly crisp. The bone stayed in because the meat closest to the bone was the juiciest, and because throwing away edible bones was not something a frugal Cuban kitchen ever did. Eaten with fingers, standing up, sometimes right out of the paper bag from a fry shop window on 12th Avenue. Kids fought over the wing pieces because wings had the highest ratio of crackling skin to meat, and skin was the whole point. Number 14. Arroz Imperial. The smell of chicken stock and a hint of saffron coloring rising from a casserole dish pulled from the oven. This was a layered rice dish. A bed of yellow rice on the bottom, a thick layer of shredded chicken mixed with mayonnaise and melted cheese in the middle, then another layer of yellow rice on top, and the whole thing baked until the cheese fused the layers together and the surface turned golden. It was invented in Miami, not in Havana. Cuban exiles created arroz imperial in the early 1960s as a party dish designed for the gatherings they held in their small rented apartments, where feeding 15 or 20 people from one oven was not a choice but a practical requirement of community survival. The dish spread through Little Havana the way any good idea spreads in a tight community. One woman made it for a quinceañera, and the guests asked how. Another tasted it at a church potluck and brought her own version to the next one. Within a few years, every Cuban household in Dade County had their own recipe, and the arguments about whose was best lasted longer than the meal itself. Some added roasted red peppers between the layers. Some used Gouda cheese instead of American. Some insisted on peas mixed into the rice, and others considered that a crime. It was architecture disguised as food. A casserole engineered to impress a crowd on a budget that allowed for nothing traditionally impressive: rice, chicken, and cheese. Those three things, layered with skill and pride, became a centerpiece. Number 13. Medianoche, the midnight sandwich. Named that because it was what you ate after dancing, after a party, after anything that kept you out past 12. Sweet egg bread instead of Cuban bread. Roast pork, ham, Swiss cheese, pickles, yellow mustard, pressed on the plancha until the egg bread turned glossy and golden and the cheese melted into the layers of pork. The sweetness of the bread against the salt of the pork and the sourness of the pickle was a combination that made no sense written down and perfect sense at 1 a.m. when your body demanded something heavy and satisfying. You could find them at every late-night ventanita along Calle Ocho, wrapped in wax paper and still warm from the press. Number 12. Elena Ruz, a sandwich named after a woman who reportedly walked into a Havana restaurant in the 1930s and asked for turkey, cream cheese, and strawberry jam on medianoche bread. The combination traveled to Miami with the exile community and stayed alive in the cafeterias and lunch counters of Little Havana for decades. It sounds like something a child would invent at a sleepover. Turkey, cream cheese, and strawberry jam. But when the bread is pressed warm and the jam liquefies and the cream cheese softens into the turkey, it becomes something that works. Sweet and savory and unexpectedly rich. A sandwich that existed nowhere else in America and that most Americans would never believe was real until they tasted it. Number 11. Colada. Not a piña colada. A colada in Little Havana was a small styrofoam cup of Cuban espresso, brewed dark and thick and sweetened with sugar that was whipped directly into the first drops of coffee to form a frothy tan crema on top called espumita. It came with a stack of tiny plastic thimble cups, so you could share it with everyone around you. This was not about caffeine alone. This was a social ritual. Construction crews passed the colada around at 7 in the morning on a job site. Office workers shared one mid-afternoon. You bought it at a Ventanita window for pocket change, and it bought you 10 minutes of conversation with whoever happened to be standing there. The sharing was the point. The coffee was the excuse. The Ventanita was something no other immigrant neighborhood in America had in quite the same way. A walk-up window cut into the side of a restaurant or a bakery, or sometimes just a converted house. You stood on the sidewalk and ordered through it. Coffee, sandwiches, croquetas, fresh juice, a shot of guarapo. It was faster than a drive-through and more personal than a counter. You knew the woman behind the glass, and she knew your order. It was the infrastructure of a neighborhood that lived outdoors, because the weather allowed it, and because the apartments were too small and too hot to linger in. The food that passed through those windows kept the sidewalks alive and kept the community talking. Number 10. Buñuelos. Twisted figure 8 knots of dough made from boiled yuca and malanga, mashed together smooth, shaped by hand, fried in oil until puffed and golden, and then soaked in a thick syrup of sugar, cinnamon, star anise, and lime peel. They came out at Christmas and stayed on the counter through New Year. The syrup was so concentrated that it crystallized slightly on the surface as the buñuelos cooled, giving them a sweet crunch before the soft dough inside. Families made dozens at a time and stacked them on platters for anyone to grab. Christmas in Little Havana without buñuelos was not Christmas at all. The smell of anise in the syrup was the smell of the holiday itself. Number 9. Fricasse de pollo. A whole chicken cut into pieces, browned in oil in a heavy pot, then braised slowly in a sauce built from crushed tomatoes, onions, green peppers, Spanish olives, cubed potatoes, a bay leaf, and a generous splash of dry white cooking wine. The sauce turned thick and brick red, and the chicken went so tender it slid off the bone at the slightest touch of a spoon. This was hurricane food. When the storm shutters went up and the power was uncertain, the women of Little Havana already had a pot of fricasse going because they knew what was coming. They knew the stove might not light tomorrow. They knew the chicken in the refrigerator would spoil without electricity. So the bird went into the pot before the wind arrived, and that pot fed the household for 2 or 3 days, reheated over whatever flame was available, whether a camp stove or a neighbor's gas burner. But fricasse was not only for hurricanes. It was the dish that appeared whenever things felt uncertain. A job lost without warning. A car that would not start and could not be fixed this month. A week where the grocery budget ran out before Thursday. One whole chicken, a few soft vegetables, a cup of cooking wine, and suddenly there was enough food on the stove to stop the worry for 3 days. The recipe asked for nothing expensive and returned everything a family needed. The women who made it did not call it survival cooking. They called it Tuesday. They called it what you make when you know how to make something from not very much at all. That knowledge was never written in a cookbook. It lived in the hands that cut the chicken and the eyes that watched the sauce thicken to exactly the right shade of red. Number 8. Natilla. A vanilla custard so simple it barely needed a recipe. Milk, sugar, egg yolks, cornstarch, a whole vanilla bean or a pour of extract, and a strip of lemon peel simmered together in a saucepan while someone stood there stirring until the mixture thickened enough to coat the back of a wooden spoon. Poured into small cups and dusted with ground cinnamon, it set in the refrigerator and came out cool and smooth with a thin skin on top that some people loved and others carefully peeled away. Children in Little Havana grew up eating Natilla the way children elsewhere grew up eating packaged pudding cups from the grocery store. Except this came from the stovetop, made by hand, and every grandmother's version tasted slightly different from the one down the street. Number 7. Carne con papa, beef and potato stew. Ground beef or cubed chuck browned with sofrito, then simmered with diced potatoes in a tomato-based broth seasoned with cumin and a bay leaf until the potatoes softened and started to dissolve into the liquid and thicken the stew on their own, served in a bowl over white rice. This was a stretch meal in its purest form, a way to make a small amount of beef feed a large family by surrounding the meat with cheap potatoes and cheaper rice. But it was also deeply warming and filling in a way that mattered even in Miami, where the rare, cool January evenings reminded people that comfort food existed for a reason beyond nostalgia. Number 6. Picadillo. Ground beef sautéed with a sofrito of onion, pepper, and garlic, then simmered in a sauce of crushed tomatoes, Spanish olives, raisins, capers, and a heavy pinch of cumin. The olives gave it salt and brine. The raisins gave it pockets of sweetness. The capers added a vinegar sharpness. The combination was distinctly Cuban and completely foreign to anyone who had never stepped foot in a Cuban home. Served over white rice with a fried egg on top in some households, without in others. 1 pound of ground beef became dinner for 5 people when the rice absorbed the sauce. Every kid in Little Havana had an opinion about the raisins. Some picked them out and left them on the edge of the plate. Some ate them first. Nobody was ever neutral on the raisins. Number 5. Pan con lechon, roast pork on Cuban bread. That is all it was on paper. But the pork had been sitting in mojo criollo for a full day, slow roasted for hours until the outside was lacquered and cracking and the inside pulled apart in long, wet strands without resistance. Piled high onto fresh Cuban bread with raw onion slices and a generous drizzle of the pan juices soaked into the bottom half. People drove from the other side of Dade County to get this sandwich from the right place. The bread turned translucent on the bottom where the mojo pooled and stayed just barely crisp on top, and the pork was so deeply seasoned with garlic and bitter orange that you could smell it on your hands for the rest of the afternoon. This was not just a sandwich. It was proof that a neighborhood existed and that the people in it knew something about pork that nobody else nearby had figured out. Number 4. Arroz con leche. Rice pudding made with whole milk, sugar, cinnamon sticks, a strip of lime zest, and a pinch of salt, cooked slowly on the stovetop until the rice swelled and the milk reduced into a thick, creamy mass. Served warm or cold depending on who made it and what time of day it showed up on the table. This was the dessert that grandmothers made without thinking, without measuring, without consulting anything written down. A little more milk if extra grandchildren were visiting. A little more sugar if the week had been particularly hard. The recipe lived in memory and in the hands that stirred it. It existed in Cuban homes long before Miami, and it survived the crossing of the Florida Straits without losing a single grain of flavor. The taste of it could send a grown adult back 40 years into a kitchen they had not stood in since childhood. What made Little Havana different from other immigrant enclaves in America was the speed of the arrival. In the early 1960s, tens of thousands of Cuban families arrived in Miami within just a few years. They did not trickle in over generations the way Italians came to the Lower East Side or the Irish filtered into South Boston. They arrived all at once, concentrated in a few square miles, carrying nothing but their memories and each other. The kitchens they rebuilt in those small rented apartments were reconstructions of the kitchens they had lost. Every dish cooked from memory was an act of preservation. Every recipe whispered to a daughter over a hot stove was a piece of a country they could not return to. The food was never just food. It was the thing that proved the old life had been real. Number 3. Dulce de leche cortada. Curdled milk candy, fresh whole milk mixed with sugar and a splash of lime juice, which caused the milk to curdle and separate into soft white curds. Then cooked down slowly, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon for close to an hour until the curds caramelized and turned into soft, crumbly lumps of deep golden sweetness. It took patience and a strong arm and a willingness to stand at the stove without stopping. Nobody outside of Cuban kitchens was making this. It was a confection that belonged entirely to the women who remembered their own mothers and grandmothers doing the same thing in Camagüey or Matanzas or the countryside outside Santiago decades before. The taste was brown sugar and burnt cream and patience. Number 2. Lechon asado. A whole pig or a large pork leg stabbed deep with a knife in dozens of places and marinated in mojo criollo for a full day, then roasted slowly for hours until the skin blistered into crackling chicharron and the meat beneath turned so tender it could be pulled apart with 2 forks and a light touch. This was the Noche Buena pig, the Christmas Eve pig. Families pooled money together weeks in advance to buy it. Someone always had a caja china, a roasting box lined with charcoal, set up in the backyard or the driveway. The smell of that pig traveled down the entire block and served as an open invitation that did not need to be spoken. Neighbors arrived with side dishes and left carrying plates wrapped in aluminum foil. The pig was never just a meal. It was the event that the entire holiday organized itself around. Number 1. Ropa vieja. The name means old clothes. Flank steak simmered slowly for hours until it shredded into long, soft threads that looked like torn fabric, then braised in a deep sauce of crushed tomatoes, red and green peppers, sliced onions, garlic, and cumin until every strand absorbed the color and the flavor of the sofrito surrounding it. It was the national dish of Cuba, and in Little Havana it carried more weight than any flag hung on a porch or any anthem played on the radio. It said we are still here. It said the island did not disappear just because we left it. A plate of ropa vieja served on a Wednesday evening in a small apartment on Southwest 12th Street was not simply dinner. It was a quiet declaration that the old life still mattered, that the crossing had not erased anything, and that the hands pulling the meat into threads had not forgotten a single thing about where they came from. Those 25 dishes were never meant to impress anyone outside the neighborhood. They were meant to keep a community fed, connected, and rooted in a memory that nobody outside those kitchen walls could take away. If you grew up with any of these on your table, you already know what they meant, and if you did not, now you do. Leave a comment and tell me which dish your family made best. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the time.